is going to show you how to set up grids in your InDesign document, specifically for multi-page documents. And when you're making a grid, you always want to start with sketches. That way you have a good idea of the content you're working with, the imagery, the type, negative space, and you see a basic plan for what you think it might look like. So all I did for this sake of this tutorial was just Googled layout sketches just to show you um, what you might be working with to use as an example. I've clicked on one already over here, and this is just showing an example of what looks like a 4-column grid, and that seems to be consistent across all of these except for this one over here. And then there's also some horizontal grid lines that will tell me where the images should start or the type should end. And so this gives me an idea of what I need to do when I get into InDesign to set up my document. There are plenty of other examples in here as well. One that you saw that I had just clicked on had, sorry, I'll call that again, the angle grid line, and you can do that as well. And for the most part, these are pretty simple and quick to do. You might have many of them. You might want to try different versions with 2 or 3 or 4-column grids, angled grids, and multiple different grids, which I'll get into as well. And it's pretty standard to have a box with an X in it represent an image, and then some large copy like title or subtitle, and then just lines to represent the body copy. And then that way it gives you an idea of what you might do with all of those levels of hierarchy. For example, this one shows title big, and then these lines of copy progressively get smaller because it looks like they're trying to go along the edge of this angle here. So this gives us a lot of information. They're super quick to do, and it's just a great way to get ideas out on paper. So when you go to the computer, you can work faster and more effectively. So I already have an InDesign document set up, and I'm going to walk through all of the steps. All right, so what I have set up over here is a few master pages. It is really helpful to design in master pages for elements that you don't want to move around or that you're going to use on multiple pages, because you can set it up once and then you can copy it down to your working pages. And if you need to make any changes, you can go back into the master page, make any changes, and it'll make all of those changes in any of the pages that have that master applied to it. So what I have set up here on this first page here is in my A master, and it's actually called A parent. It used to be called master. I'm not sure when that changed, so they mean the same. So this shows me this 3-column grid. It has standard gutters and 4 rows. So this gives me something simple to work with. I made it in here. I can select it in here and make any changes. And then I can just go ahead and drag it right into my pages here. So you can see this A parent, and now there's this little A here. And if I click on it, it'll take me here, and it's the same thing. The only difference with this is I can't select anything in here, which is great because I won't accidentally grab a grid line and move it. I have to go into the master page to do that. And that is a great chance to go in and say like, okay, these 2 grid lines are too close to this grid line and I actually want to offset it a little bit. And I can do that and it will make that change in here as well. I actually don't want to do that. I just wanted to show you that. So I'm going to undo that. All right, and now I also have a B parent set up. So you might notice over here in our pages, there's a little A in the corner, and that is because the A master is applied to all of those pages in here. Okay, so the first 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 all have A master. And then as I get down here, there's a B. So that is because I switched my grid up a little bit. And this one is a 4-column, and you can see that these lines are creating more rectangular shapes. And I have decided to use that for any of my chapter openers or article openers. So in a book, you'd probably call it a chapter opener. In a magazine, you'd call it an article opener. And that is because I want those to look visually different than the interior pages to signal the reader that they're in a new section. So I have those two set up that I'm going to be able to use whenever I need them and pull them right down from the master pages to use as I need to. And then I'm just also going to go into explain a little bit how I've used these master pages. Let's see. So I'll hide that for now. So this is the B master, and if I hit W on my keyboard on a Mac, it will hide and show the grid lines, which I find to be really helpful because sometimes they're very confusing, and I just want to see what it looks like when it's going to be printed. It will also get rid of any bleed, so this shows me what it looks like cropped and as if it were printed, sort of. So what I have set up here is a large header and some body copy and a lot of negative space. And then this black box here is just representing an image. The next page, and now this is using the A master. You can see there's a little A here. This is using the A master page. And this has a little bit more content, smaller images and more of them, but also a lot of negative space as well. So one thing that's great about this is it shows you how flexible this grid is. A lot of times people think using a grid is really restrictive, and it's not. It's really just to give you some unity and some organization within your design as a whole. And that is because as humans, we tend to want to organize things or put things in buckets, and it helps us make sense of the world. So we use that in our designs because it's very pleasing and helpful for the viewer to have things organized and in buckets so we don't have to do that in our own brain. So I can move anything I want anywhere. Say I don't want this line of images here. Maybe I want one offset. I can do that. And I'm just going to put it right in that grid line. And you can see that there's a really nice grid line from here to here. And the negative space is far away. The image and the type is far away, but it still creates that nice line. Another thing us humans do well is connecting the dots. So if you have a circle shape, but the whole thing isn't filled in, our eye will naturally fill that in. So a strong alignment you can use across a whole spread, and our eye will connect the dots, and it's pleasing to see things aligned like that. It's also really helpful if you are trying to disrupt the reader to get their attention, maybe with a pull quote. You could purposely offset it off of the grid, and that will make us go right to it because it's something different and not organized. All right, so, and we also have a lot of flexibility between using all three columns for the type or just one, or spanning multiple columns with type like I did here, even though this is a different master. All right. Also, one other thing I want to note is the reason why the chapter opener is lighter in content than the other pages. Typically with a magazine, if you're designing a magazine, it's for leisure reading. So we don't really want to sit down for hours and dive into a novel. We want to just kind of look at pictures and pull quotes in large type and maybe read some articles. So I would like to say humans are a little lazy, but the better way to say it is humans like to find the path of least resistance. So if we are looking to gather information from something that we're reading, we're going to look at pictures, we're going to look at large copy, and anything that is catching our eye. It could be because it's a different color or it's off the grid, any number of things. So in a chapter opener like this, we have one large image, we have large copy, and a small amount of type and a lot of negative space. That is a great way to get someone hooked on the article or the chapter or the book, whatever it is. And it allows us that least resistance to getting that content and that information. So we see a picture, we can learn a little bit about what this might be about. We can see the large chapter opener and maybe a pull quote. Sometimes people might have the opening paragraphs always set 2 points bigger, for example, to kind of lead us in. So that's another option. And whatever you do, that's a rule. So every time you have a chapter opener, it's always this size copy, and it's always this amount of copy generally, and has lots of negative space in one big image, for example. So you can set that as a rule for yourself. That way, I see all of this information, I read this small amount of copy, and I'm hooked. I'm interested to learn more and read more. So if I get to the next page and there's more copy, I'm not going to feel so daunted by reading it. I'm going to feel like I want to read it and look at these images and read all of this copy. So that is why I use the two different master pages. So it was easier for me to set up a chapter opener with less content. And you can set that up however you want. And it also might be when I look at this document, I'm like, well, I really like this negative space, but it feels a little too big. It's not balanced enough. So I can just go right back into my master page here and decide that I'm not going to have these three be equal. I am going to adjust them, and I'm going to want to do that. There we go. On both sides. You don't have to. It's just that's the rule I'm making. And then I might say, okay, that might feel a little better. And then when I go into my chapter opener, I can adjust this back on the, something funny is going on in here. I can adjust this back on the grid line that I just made. And for some reason I had an active grid right in the page here. I'm deleting that. I don't want that. I want to not have clickable grid lines. And I can put that right back on the new grid line I made and say, all right, great, that feels a little better. It's not so big of a space. All right. So one other thing that is already set up in here, and we covered this in this setup tutorial, is the margins and the bleed. And that was set up when we opened up our document and we looked at that whole dialog box. We were able to set up our bleed and our margins. You can go back in anytime and change those if you go to document setup, and everything's in here. I'm going to keep it as is, but if you want to change anything, you can. Bleed needs to be used. So as you notice, if this is my image, it's going out to the bleed line. And you'll notice I'm using my margin as my do not pass go grid line. And so I know I don't want anything outside in between the margin and the cut or the bleed line unless I want it to bleed. So I have that set up for me as well. All right, so one other thing I'm going to show you is adding another master page. I already have it in here, so I'll just go through the process of how I set it up. And if you go into here, you can go into new parent. When you click on that, it will give you an editable field here. I tend to just keep the A, B, C, and D or whatever. Every once in a while, I might put some, like a little note in there about what it's for, but it doesn't allow you that much space to write, so I tend to just keep the default. You can build it off of a previous one that you've built. If you want to use this grid, for example, and add to it, you can start it with that, and it will create a new master page for you, but it will allow you to edit it and still have that content. So the 2 pages, because I have this set up as facing pages, so that I do want to keep that, but you could make singles if you wanted. I haven't found a purpose for that yet, but you may. And you can also change content in here. So yeah, it gives you a chance to kind of label it if you want. I'm just going to keep it the same. I'm actually going to cancel this because I already have one set up. So I made a C guide here. I'm going to go into that. And what I did with this one is I set it up with a standard 4-column grid, but I did not set up my horizontal grid lines using the system like I'm going to show you in a minute. I created my own. And then I'm also showing an example of an angled grid line, so we can talk about that as well. All right, so how you set this up, if this was a new page and nothing was in here, you can go into Layout, Create Guides. Now I already have something in here, and if you do and you want to change it, you can remove existing ruler guides, and that will clear everything so you can start over. Or you can do what I did before and like actually click on them and move them around. Setting them up in Create Guides does the math for you. So it's a quick and easy way to set up guides. It just, if you want more flexibility or a dynamic grid, you'll have to adjust that yourself. But I like starting this way. So I am going to remove existing grid lines so we can start again. And I do want to go ahead and start with 4 columns. And the rows, the horizontal grid lines, we can set up as well. So I'll just set it up with 2 for now. So it's just basically breaking the page in half and then in 4s. You also are able to control the gutters in here, and that is the space between the grid lines. So what we do not want is to have a grid line for type end and begin where the next one ends and begins. We want a little space in between. And that way, say this column of type isn't butted right up against this column of type. We have this little gap in the middle, and the gap is called the gutter. And we also don't want to have an image with type underneath it butting right up against it. We want a little space, so we have the gutter. I'm going to leave the default. I find that to work out just great, but if you like to have bigger gutters or smaller gutters for any reason, you can control that in here. One other thing you might notice is it says Fit Guides 2. This is fit to margins, so it will equally space these 4 columns between these 2 margins. If I want to, I can do it from the page. So it'll equally space these 4 columns from the edge of the page to the middle of the page, and then so onto the other side. I'm going to go to margins because I've established my outer margin edge as a do not pass go. I don't want anything in there, so I don't want it to equally space in here, because what you might notice is this column here from margin to this grid line is smaller than this one here. I don't want that. I want them to be equally spaced. If you don't want them to be equally spaced, you can choose it to page. So we'll leave that, and I'll click OK. Great. So if we're going to go back and take a peek at that sketch, there's a couple of things I'm noticing with the horizontal grid lines. This is not set center in the page. This one looks like it is, and it has a little bit of a gutter here, which is great. But if I want something that's asymmetrical, it's not going to give it to me. So I'm going to have to just go ahead and make that myself. I'm going to keep the one I made that's center in the page because I think that's working. And then I'm just going to go ahead and grab another one and drag it down here and create that grid line. So I have another horizontal grid line. One other thing that is missing in here that is important is space for your page numbers, or any other thing that you might find that you need when you're looking at your type hierarchy, which we'll talk about in the next tutorial. I'm going to decide my page numbers are going to go at the bottom. So I am going to set a grid line down here. And the reason why is because I don't want to have the same grid line for my body copy and for my page numbers, because then they're going to crash into each other. So what I'm going to do is set up this grid line here, and this is going to be the bottom of my page for my body copy, and then this margin. So in between these 2 lines here is where my my page numbers can live. So I know nothing's going to go in that space other than that. And what I'm likely going to do is baseline align it to this bottom grid line here where the margin is, and that will give me extra space on top. So I don't have a gutter in here. If my page number system was going to be so big that it was going to reach the top, I probably would want to have a gutter line in here too. But the way I work is I tend to just make it extra big and baseline align it, so I don't have to worry about it. And I also like to work with the fewest grid lines possible because I get very confused looking at my document. And to me, if I have too many grid lines, some people like working with like a 16 column grid. I find that it makes my pages more sloppy, and I'm not as happy with the design decisions I'm making, and it confuses me. So I like to work with less. You can work with more. There's nothing wrong with that. All right. Let me make sure I got this all covered. One other thing that I added in here was a angle grid line. There are all types of grids. There's a book called Making and Breaking the Grid that is really wonderful. It's huge, and it goes into all the different types of grids. There's modular grids, angular grids, and then how to break them, how to use them and break them. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would recommend getting that book. With this grid line, I drew this in myself using the line tool. And then what I did is change the color of it to match the other grid lines. This way, when I'm looking at it, I know it's a grid line. And I know this color is my margin line. So I'm keeping that consistency to make it easier for me when I'm looking at my grids. And these are very simple grids. They can get really busy. You can also add a circle in here if you want, have a circular grid, offset it on the page. There's lots of things you can do. And you should definitely consult the content of the work that you're going to be designing with to decide how you're going to lay it out. And then you start with sketches first. All right, so now that we have all that laid out, I am just going to show this in use, and I already have it laid out here. Great. Okay. So I'm just using this blue as a placeholder for an image. So for example, this could be one large image using this angular grid. You could set your type and have it angled as well if you'd like. But I'm using it for my image, and then I'm using this spot over here for my type. And this is what it looks like without any grids on. And this is the same 4-column grid as my chapter opener, which I should not have done. I'm kind of hacking this grid together for the tutorial. So because this is an interior spread, I should have used this grid. And maybe what I could have done when I was setting up this master page is used this grid as a parent to build off of, so I could have added the angle to that one. But for the sake of time, I'll keep it as is. So I've also already flowed copy in here, and you might notice there is this little red check mark here, and that is called overset type. So that is kind of a little warning there for you to let you know that there's more type that exists in this type block that's hidden because I've ended it here. So that's kind of frustrating because I've created this grid line here and I can't go past it. So I have to do something with this type. I also tend to have a rule for myself that if I see overset type or this little icon, I always get rid of it. Sometimes you might have a type block and you go to expand it and there's no more type down here. It just happens to be like a space, like an extra return, and that will also record it as overset type when it's really not. So you don't necessarily have to fix that, but I have the rule to fix it because it's really easy when you're setting documents with many pages to miss something like that. So I've trained my brain to see this and be like, oh no, alert, I have to fix that. And in this case, we do have to fix it. So what I'm going to show you how to do is how to flow type. And I'm going to set up another type block. Somehow got this off my grid here. Here we go. Let me fix that first. Will drive me nuts. Okay, I'm going to set up another type block here. And it's in my grid. So I have one block of type spanning 2 columns, and then I just made another type block, and it's just this one column here. And I need to get my type in there. So I want this type to go in here. So I'm going to actually click right on this little overset type thing. And I actually had to click on it twice. I had to be selected in here first. And I think that's because these type blocks were so close. And what it does is it grabs that copy. So you can see it has a little link and then representing some copy here. So if I'm here, it will link it. If I'm here, it will not link it. And that is because there's no text block here. It doesn't mean I still can't drop it in there and it'll just kind of throw itself in there, but I don't want to do that because that's, to me, more work. I just prefer making the text block and then plopping in. So look for this little icon and then click it and it will flow right into there. Now, if I were to make any changes to this type block, it will automatically flow it into here and they're connected. So whatever doesn't fit in here will go right into here. And you can see I still have overset type, so I would probably want to add another spread, and I can do that across spreads as well. So you could just keep clicking it, clicking it, and then going to another spread and flowing it wherever you want. But I'm going to stop here for the sake of time. So that's overset type. So one other thing I want to call out is that this block of type is spanning 2 columns. And this is spanning 1 column, and these are 2 separate type blocks. Let me show it better here. Yeah, so this is 3 columns of type, 1 type block. This is 2 columns of type, 2 text blocks. The reason why I set it up that way is because this is spanning the 2 and this is the 1, and that's just the way I set it up. the way I set this one up is one text block, and it fits in these grid lines perfectly because I told it to. So that's called text frame options. And you can do that in Object. And where are you hiding? Text frame options. Or you can, anytime you're in this dialog box, you can look over here. And this is the Command B, so that you know the shortcut. So if you tend to use this a lot, just go right to the shortcut. Otherwise, it's an Object, whoopsie, Object text frame options, or Command B. So that'll open up all the options for this text frame box. And it is set up to 3 columns, and this gutter width is the same gutter width that I set up in my grids. So they match. If they don't match, then my type won't match. It won't go on the grid line, it'll go to where I told it to. So make sure those match when you're setting them up. And I went the wrong way there. No, I didn't. And well, I'm just going to click cancel. And you can also adjust other things in here, but you definitely want to make sure that you have your columns correct and your gutter correct so that it lines up the way it's supposed to. And I think that's all I'm going to cover for grids today. I hope that was helpful.